Welcome to the Bible and Science. This is Dave Prentice. I'm a retired public high school teacher, certified in all branches of science and math. I've also taught on the Bible and Science for many years, both in the U.S. and on many overseas mission trips. This is the Bible and Science, episode number 26. We've been dealing with a bunch of biblical topics. This one is going to go more into the scientific realm. We're going to talk about the origin of life. Could life be something that would have naturally appeared just by natural processes, or is it something that required supernatural intervention? Anytime we're trying to deal with the origin of everything, we can break it down into a number of different ways, and the way that I do it is, number one, how did matter and energy come into existence? We talked about that there is no known natural process that could make it all come into existence. Then, once matter and energy did appear, how did they get from there to their present state? We talked just a little bit about the idea of the Big Bang and how the universe is going from organization toward disorganization. It's going from complex toward simple. Well, now the next question we're dealing with is how did life begin? Does it give indications that it could have happened by purely natural processes, or does it give indications that it requires something outside of nature? And later we'll talk about how life got from there to its present state, the biological considerations and the fossil record and things like that. So this is where a lot of people will get upset, and they'll say, well, you're bringing God into science when you're looking for the design in nature. Well, the search for design is a normal part of science. Anytime an airplane crashes, the National Transportation Safety Board comes along and they investigate to find out whether it was an accident or whether somebody deliberately sabotaged the plane. Similarly, when a building burns under suspicious circumstances, the arson investigators are going to look to see whether it was likely arson or whether maybe a mouse chewed through some wires or something like that. Medical examiners, anytime somebody dies under suspicious circumstances, they're looking to see, are there indications this was deliberately that it was designed. And then we have an organization called SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, where there's a bunch of scientists that are looking to see whether there are non-random signals coming in from space. Non-random, that is, designed. And then, if you want to find out whether a piece of something you pick up in the desert is an arrowhead or just a natural piece of stone, you're going to look at the knowledge that's been gained by archaeology to figure out whether it was designed or an accident. And then you also, something that I participated in, may try to determine whether populations are distributed randomly or non-randomly. This is not necessarily saying why. I was in a class one time where we were looking at the location of anthills going up levees to see how high they were. And so we used standard statistical testing and determined that the distribution of anthills on the levee was not random. Why? We didn't know. It just was not random. It's just something that you can tell without telling why it's not random. So remember, the idea of evolution, of course, is simple to complex, but it also depends upon the idea of natural processes only. And there have been a number of honest scientists that have said this. Dr. Todd in 1999 said, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. That was in Nature magazine. And 70 years before that, Dr. Watson, writing also in Nature magazine, talked about the theory of evolution itself, which was a theory universally accepted, not because it could be proved by logically coherent evidence to be true, but because the only alternative, special creation, is clearly incredible. Well, if you've decided that you will not allow anything but natural processes, well, that totally writes the possibility of God entirely out of the picture. I want to look at the evidence and indicate, does it seem whether natural processes are sufficient, or might we have to look for something outside of nature? There are many that want to explain absolutely everything by purely natural processes, as I just mentioned on the previous slide. This is really something that goes back a long way, but Darwin clearly stated it. He said that if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed that could not possibly have resulted from numerous slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Well, a lot of people have that same attitude. They believe that absolutely everything must be explainable by purely natural processes, because if there's even one physical phenomenon that has a non-natural, that is a supernatural cause, then all of evolutionary logic is unreliable. Remember, I've asked you before about this. Suppose I tell you that all dogs bark. Well, if Fido is a dog, then Fido has to bark. Yes, but is it really true that all dogs bark? No, there's an entire breed in Africa called the Basenji. They don't bark. So if you can find one exception, then your whole system of logic is unreliable. I love a book by Michael Behe. He's a theistic evolutionist, but his book deals with something that's commonly called Darwin's black box. Michael Behe is a professional scientist. He's an educator at a university. He's a theistic evolutionist, but he believes, okay, there has to be a God behind this, because much of modern biological research says, no, we won't have God in here. We'll never allow God at any point. Well, okay, the way that Dr. Behe puts it in his book, Darwin's Black Box, is that much of modern biological research is like a group of detectives investigating a flattened body. So they're searching for clues as to what the cause of death was. They have to keep stepping around the elephant in the room that's standing on the body. But because they've agreed in advance that there's no such thing as an elephant, none of them is willing to say, well, maybe the elephant did it. Rather than go against the majority view and be labeled incompetent or superstitious, they keep searching for other explanations. Well, Dr. Behe's point is, come on, let's quit overlooking the possibility of design in nature. So here are some of the common arguments against design. Number one, things can't be designed because that would bring God into science. Well, that's not a scientific argument, it's a philosophical argument. You don't want God in science. And besides that, that's really dumb. In order to disprove design, you would have had to have been watching since the beginning of the earth, and we don't have any records of that. The second one says that things can't be designed because we don't like the way they're put together. For instance, the panda has what's commonly called a thumb. It's not really a thumb. It's a bony protrusion that it uses to strip the leaves off eucalyptus branches. Well, one time we bought a car, and it had a high beam headlight lamp right in the middle of the instrument panel, right in front of my eyes. Whenever I would drive it and turn on the high beams, it would blind me. So I reached the conclusion it must just be totally random, because I don't like the way that light is put there, so therefore it must have just been random. Nobody could have designed it that way. No, that just shows that if there's a designer, I either disagree with him or her, or don't understand the purposes behind what was done. So that's not a very good argument against design. It's just a matter of personal preference. Now, arguments for design. This really is, to me, the weakest one. People say, oh, look, nature is so beautiful. There has to be a designer with a sense of beauty. Well, that's a matter of opinion. I do believe that myself. But somebody who thinks nature is ugly would not find that at all persuasive. What do you mean beauty in nature? There's no beauty in nature. But a much better argument, this is what Darwin said regarding the possibility of design in nature. He said, to suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light and so forth, he says, to say this could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. So was he saying I give up? No, he made up a story. Darwin wrote, reason tells me that if numerous gradations from a simple and imperfect eye to one complex and perfect can be shown to exist, each grade being useful to its possessor, as is certain the case, if further the eye ever varies and the variations be inherited, as is likewise certainly the case, and if variations should be useful to any animal under changing conditions of life, then the difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could have been formed by natural selection should not be considered as subversive of the story. So what Darwin was saying, yeah, I know what it looks like to you, but I can make up a story. Here's my story. And since I'm so smart, you have to believe my story is true. Well, I don't believe that story. There are a great many stories that I don't believe. Just because you can make up one doesn't require me to believe it. I want to look at the arguments in favor of it. So could things be designed? You may have seen Mount Rushmore before. And did you know that there's a new face that was put on there? Oh, yeah, that was me. I was up at Mount Rushmore some years ago when there was a government shutdown, and the workmen were hurting for money, so I paid them to carve another face on there. No, that's not true. I have to repent of lying. Can you say Photoshop? But in any collection of matter, there's no one arrangement that's more or less improbable than any other. So somebody's probably going to win the lottery sooner or later. But that's not what the search for design is about. We're looking not just for improbability, but improbability in a specific direction. Is Mount Rushmore an accident? Or if the same person wins the lottery every week, aren't we going to get a little suspicious after a while? In nature, most arrangements produce meaningless junk. Only a few of them produce life. The question is, how improbable is it that those specific arrangements of matter could arise by chance? So this is one of the more powerful arguments for design in nature. Opinion? Nah, not much. But extreme improbability in a specific pattern, in a specific direction, that would lead us to conclude, oh, there could be something designed here. So Dr. Behe talks about groundhogs. I live in the South, so I'd talk about armadillos. But if you've heard the old question about why did the chicken cross the road, it's just to show the armadillo it really was possible. Armadillos are notorious for getting squashed on the road. So there's no theoretical barrier that says it's impossible for an armadillo or a groundhog to make it across a busy 1,000-lane superhighway, but he just doesn't. That's just the way it works. There's no theoretical barrier, but if there's improbability in a specific direction, even a better argument for design is called irreducible complexity. You have a thing that's got a certain number of parts, it's fairly complex. If you find something that if you take out one part, it quits working, you can't reduce it any amount whatsoever, That's what Dr. Behe calls irreducible complexity. A mousetrap would be a good example of an irreducibly complex machine. It has to have a base, a hammer, a spring, a latch, and a trigger. So if any one of them is missing or not working properly, you really wouldn't say it's a mousetrap, but you'd say I have a pile of junk. If there's any part of an irreducibly complex machine that's missing or not working, then the whole thing is a useless waste of materials. So we're going to apply this test repeatedly to see whether it's likely things in nature, in living things, are irreducibly complex. A machine, in addition, must have at least a certain function, a certain minimal function to be of any use. So it's not possible to make an irreducibly complex machine by gradual changes in a different type of machine. You could possibly modify a rat trap to make a mouse trap, but you couldn't make one out of a can opener. You'd quickly have a piece of junk that couldn't open cans and also couldn't catch mice. So likewise, irreducibly complex mechanisms in living things could not have evolved from mechanisms of a different type. Natural selection, instead of encouraging the development of new things, would have eliminated the non-functioning intermediates. So let's say what we could predict about what we should find regarding the origin of life. If you believe in evolution, which is initial disorganization, you would think that life is just the result of random chemical processes. So that is, natural processes should be sufficient to produce life without any supernatural intervention. Also, since the chemistry to produce life has not been seen to occur under present conditions, we would expect that the early Earth's environment was much different than what it is under present conditions. In order for life to come into existence in the first place, things must have been very, very different. Now on the other side, creation, which says initial complexity, we expect that life should be far too complex to be the result of purely natural processes. We also expect to find evidence that the early Earth's environment was suitable to sustain life as we know it. That is, the environment would probably have been quite similar to the way it is today. But remember, some evolutionists are going to say, no, you have to exclude anything that's not naturalistic. No, I think we need to take a fair and balanced look at both sides, natural and maybe non-natural as well. So here's the most common scenario for how life could have evolved just from natural processes by chemical reactions and chemical processes. This apparatus that you see on the screen there is the actual apparatus that was designed by Dr. Stanley Miller. He was following a hypothesis that had come along before him called the Oparin-Haldane Hypothesis. Oparin was a Russian biochemist and Haldane was British. So between the two of them, they put together an idea that said, what would we need in order to make the components of living things? Now, have you ever thought about this? You're made mainly of schnapps. Schnapps. Carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, phosphorus. That's at a bare minimum that you have to have even to be alive if you're the simplest cell. Now, of course, we have a whole bunch of other things. We have calcium and chlorine and potassium and so forth. But at the bare minimum, you need schnapps. So Dr. Miller was trying to figure out how could he put together some things that would produce life. Notice there's no phosphorus up there, but something that could come together and produce the components of life, amino acids. So he made an apparatus where it was a glass device where the components would circulate around, and he had a spark discharge inside of a 5-liter flask, and he would let the chemicals circulate around. He had water containing organic compounds, and then he also had what's called a cold trap, so that he could remove things before they would be damaged. So other experiments have used different energy sources, or maybe extra gases, other gases, but they all pretty much follow Dr. Miller's design. And if anybody has come up with another design, I'd be happy to go into that too. So Dr. Miller was trying to produce cells. You're made out of cells, and the cells are made out of schnapps. 18 of the amino acids used in your proteins don't require any phosphorus, 2 do. So you do have to have carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and phosphorus. Those are the chemical arrangements in order to produce proteins. These are the amino acids, which then will be arranged into proteins. So you have glycine, L-alanine, L-valine, L-isoleucine, L-proline, and so forth. You have 20 amino acids that are used in proteins. Now, these are not the only possible types of amino acids. They're called amino because they have an amine group, which is the NH on one end, NH2, NH3. That's what makes it an amino acid. Not amine old acid, but an amino acid. So these things are the components of every known protein. There are bunch of other ways that you could combine these chemicals, but they don't produce amino acids. There are probably hundreds of ways you could combine these chemicals, but these are the 20 amino acids, the specific ones that have been found to be used in proteins. And our cells are made of proteins. Our proteins are made out of amino acids. Our amino acids are made out of schnapps. So if you look at those amino acids on the previous page, which we'll get back to later, here are some problems in trying to produce those. Dr. Miller put together his mixture of chemicals and he let it circulate around. And after a while, he found he had produced a majority of the amino acids used in living things, but that wasn't all he got. He had a whole bunch of stuff. But one of the obvious things is that he had to eliminate free oxygen. Even in the lowest sediments, Precambrian sediments, all the way down to basement rock, they contain red beds, which are oxidized deposits, showing the presence of free oxygen. So the evidence that we have from geology indicates that the atmosphere has always contained free oxygen. Even the evolutionary scenario for the origin of the Earth states there would have been some oxygen present from the beginning. So this is called a primordial soup, the mixture of chemicals that supposedly gave rise to living things. Well, of course, we've never found a single trace of the primordial soup anywhere. Oxygen is one of the most reactive elements there is. It's second only to fluorine as far as taking away electrons from other things. So I had somebody ask me one time, we were debating in the newspaper, he said, well, why don't living things rust away? Okay, oxygen is essential to life, but it interferes with the chemistry that would have been needed for life to evolve just from chemicals. So oxygen is one of the most reactive elements. And when we have a mixture of chemicals containing free oxygen, not in a compound with something else, but free oxygen, when that mixture is allowed to react on its own, the oxygen is so reactive that it'll overpower many of the other chemicals, and it'll react faster than they do and produce biologically useless compounds. So the reactions in living things don't have a problem because they don't occur on their own. They're able to overcome the natural tendencies of oxygen because they're guided by the information in DNA. So on the early Earth, before living things came along, we're trying to put together living things. Where's your DNA? Oh, wait, no. DNA is one of the things you're trying to produce. It wouldn't have been there from the beginning So you couldn't be sure that only the proper reactions occurred. And then here's another thing that you might have never thought about. If you go down to the beach, they want you to put on the sunblock so you won't scar your skin, so you won't get a terrible sunburn. Well, without oxygen in the atmosphere, there'd be nothing to filter out one specific wavelength of ultraviolet. Earlier, we talked about waves and wavelength, okay? So they're waves with a length of 310 nanometers. These are one of the primary wavelengths that the sun puts out. Well, if there were no oxygen in the atmosphere, there'd be nothing to filter out the 310 nanometer ultraviolet radiation. And these things are absolutely deadly. If they hit an organic compound, a carbon-based compound, well, they're going to rapidly break down the methane and ammonia used in the primordial soup. And they would also destroy the amino acids and other organic compounds as fast as they could form. So if you have free oxygen, you get the wrong reactions because oxygen is so reactive. But if you have no free oxygen, then the components that you want are going to break down very rapidly. So you got a dilemma on your hands. If you want to include oxygen, okay, that's fine, but you're going to get the wrong reactions. If you don't want to include oxygen, then you're going to break things apart just as fast as they could form. So these are not all of the problems. There's still a whole lot more. I'll just give you a few more in this session, and then the next session we'll come back and continue. So here's some more problems with the so-called primordial soup. The same energy source that produces the organic compounds, whether you're giving them spark or ultraviolet or something like that, the same energy source that enabled the organic compounds to come together, it quickly destroys them unless they're removed by some sort of a thing which is called a cold trap. Frequently, we're told that lightning would have been the source of the energy. Well, the problem is lightning is going to fry stuff. So what you have to do is bring together some of these chemicals and then allow a little bit of electricity to hit them so they'll come together. But you better get them out of there real quickly, because the next time that the lightning strikes, it's going to destroy what you just put together. So in Dr. Miller's apparatus, he had a container with water with organic compounds that were formed, but notice he had a cold trap down at the lower right side. This is necessary because otherwise the next time the energy source operates, it's going to kill, it's going to destroy whatever you put together so far. And what makes up the majority of the atmosphere? Most people will say oxygen. That's not the case. Nitrogen makes up about 78% of the atmosphere. Its natural condition is in the form of two atoms tightly bonded together into a nitrogen molecule, N2. Atmospheric nitrogen is so inactive you could actually use it as a fire extinguisher in many cases. So many of the major components of cells are proteins. Proteins depend upon amino acids. They're identified by an amine group, NH2, on one end. The minus sign in front of the N indicates it wants to form a chemical bond with something. So in order for amine groups to form in the first place, oh, look at that, you got one N on the end. So free nitrogen must be available in order for amine groups to form in the first place. So in nature, nitrogen is tightly bonded together into the form of an N2 molecule. So before you can use it in living things, you have to separate it. This is called fixation from its unreactive natural form of N2 into a potentially reactive form of two individual atoms of nitrogen. This is not just a casual little problem. Most nitrogen fixation is done by bacteria, but the bacteria would not have existed before the first cell came alive because the bacteria are cells. The other way nitrogen is fixated is by lightning. So if that's the case, then that's going to eliminate ultraviolet and heat and impact energy and so forth as possible sources for the energy to bring together the first living things. But if lightning were responsible, it would have had to strike just exactly the right place at exactly the right strength to make fixated products such as amine groups. Then it would have to wait exactly the right amount of time for these amine groups to diffuse through the environment. Then it would once again have to strike at exactly the same spot, but at a greatly reduced strength to make those things combine into amino acids. Well, we're only about halfway through, but I want to try to keep these down to around a half hour or so. So we will continue on next time talking more about the primordial soup.